After starting college, my parents bought a house elsewhere, and I never returned to the town again. My return home this time was prompted by a call from my uncle. "I want to tell you about something that happened in the past. Folks back home say you've become a writer. Could you help me write this down? Otherwise, I fear no one will ever know." My hometown remained the same as it always was. I came back to uncover the truth behind an incident that had once shocked the entire town. Am I scared? I asked myself. A little bit. Crossing the town and walking a kilometer east, I arrived at my uncle's ranch. The gate to my uncle's house was still unlocked, and as I pushed the door open, I was greeted by the sight of the graves of my uncle's wife and daughter. Simple tombstones and well-maintained graves, with signs that the earth on the edges had been recently disturbed. The graves were larger than any others I had seen, emanating a sorrowful calm. The grass on the ranch had been neglected and was somewhat unkempt, but the ranch itself was very clean. It seemed as if no livestock had been kept for a long time, unlike my childhood visits when there were lively chickens, ducks, geese, and the slow-moving cattle and sheep everywhere. My uncle's house was right across from the graves. I knocked on the door, and after a brief moment, it was gently opened. My uncle appeared in the doorway, seated in a wheelchair. "Come in," he turned his wheelchair, whispering to me. That case had shocked the whole province. My uncle had been away selling livestock for 5 days, and when he returned home and opened the door, what awaited him were the cold bodies of his wife and daughter. The case was quickly solved, and the suspect was soon identified as Ethan, who had just dropped out of school and returned to the town. The evidence left at the scene and eyewitness testimony confirmed that Ethan was the perpetrator. He had raped my uncle's wife and, to prevent her from screaming, covered her mouth and nose. During the assault, my uncle's 2-year-old daughter, crying, crawled over to her mother. Ethan picked up the little girl and threw her against the wall, killing her on the spot. My uncle's wife suffocated to death because Ethan had covered her mouth and nose. The details of the case were clear, with no doubts whatsoever. The only point of contention was that Ethan was under 14 years old at that time. Ethan's parents somehow found a renowned lawyer who could turn the situation around with just a few words. They managed to portray the case of rape and murder as an affair between a married woman who seduced an ignorant adolescent boy. The death of my uncle's wife was described as a sudden seizure, with Ethan covering her mouth and nose merely to administer first aid. As for the death of my uncle's daughter, it was depicted as accidental harm caused by Ethan trying to push her to a safe spot to prevent her from being injured during her mother's supposed seizure. No one knew what price Ethan's parents had paid to smooth things over, but the final verdict was 4 years of juvenile correctional labor. Naturally, my uncle did not accept this outcome. He continued to appeal, but the legal battles became increasingly difficult, and he eventually could not continue, returning to the town despondent. The story did not end there, rather, it was just the beginning. 4 years later, Ethan was released and returned home. In the second month after his return, he disappeared. Witnesses claimed they saw Ethan walking toward the ranch on the day he disappeared but never saw him return. My uncle became the prime suspect for taking justice into his own hands out of dissatisfaction with the legal ruling. That's what everyone thought. But the truth was far from it. "It was me who killed him," my uncle said bluntly after I had taken a seat. "This is the first and probably the last time I'll talk about this. Let me start from the beginning." I nodded, softly acknowledging. Throughout the difficult process of litigation, my uncle gradually believed that justice for his wife and daughter couldn't be sought through the law. To get justice, he had to take matters into his own hands. My uncle did not strike immediately when Ethan returned to town, he still gave Ethan a chance. If Ethan had genuinely recognized the severity of his crimes during his 4 years of reformation and had sincerely sought his forgiveness, maybe my uncle wouldn't have taken this final step. But Ethan didn't, neither did his parents. On the night of his return, my uncle stealthily sneaked beneath Ethan's windowsill and heard the sounds of him and his parents celebrating his newfound freedom. They had set a table full of drinks and food, laughing and talking joyously. My uncle hid under their window, listening to the laughter inside, clenching his fists. They didn't mention the sins they'd committed, showed no remorse, no guilt. Why should his wife and daughter die because of such people, while they could all live well in this world? They died because of him, but they could start anew without any guilt. That wasn't fair. How did you get Ethan to come to the ranch? I asked my uncle. He smiled. I told him, if he didn't come, I'd be watching him, whatever he did, wherever he went, I would know, like a ghost following him. So he just came. I was somewhat skeptical. The only way to deal with evil is to be more evil than it, my uncle said. Ethan arrived at the ranch one afternoon. The first thing he saw, of course, were the graves of my uncle's wife and daughter, but he wasn't scared away. He still had a mocking smile on his face and even waved at the graves. It seemed he came to the ranch with a challenging mindset. He pushed the door and entered my uncle's house, finding no one inside. So he took another step forward. My uncle, hiding behind the door, threw a lasso and caught him around the neck. There was a struggle, of course, but the rope was securely fastened around his neck, and years of labor had made my uncle's hands stronger than those of an 18-year-old troublemaker could resist. It didn't take long for Ethan to lie on the floor, motionless. 2 weeks later, the police arrived at the ranch with a search warrant. Ethan's parents initially thought their son had started hanging out with his old friends again, as he used to disappear for a week at a time. But given that he had just been released, his absence for 2 weeks straight was disconcerting. They called Ethan's former friends, but none had seen him, prompting them to report him missing in a panic. That day, a tall, thin police officer led a team to my uncle's home and presented the search warrant. The police split into 2 groups, one to search the ranch and the surrounding areas of the town, and the other to conduct a thorough search of the ranch. The tall officer sat down in front of my uncle. I know the grudge between you two, but I hope you haven't done anything foolish. My uncle, head down, offered a wry smile. Of course I wouldn't do something foolish, not for him. It's not worth it. That's good to hear. The officer stopped talking, just watching his subordinates working outside. But after a morning passed with no discoveries, the tall officer, incredulous, ordered his team to search the ranch again, only to come up empty-handed once more. "Officer, may I go back inside now?" My uncle stood up casually and, without waiting for a response from the thin man, turned and walked towards his house. Without looking, he knew the man must be staring daggers at his retreating back. My uncle paused his steps, turned around, and said, "He was a troublemaker, could have run into someone on the streets, anyone. Why do you suspect it has to be me? He's only been out a month. Even the most brazen criminal wouldn't reoffend this quickly." "Prison is not a playful place," the thin officer said. "The only person with such hatred to want him completely gone is you. If that's what you insist on believing, then I have nothing more to say," my uncle remarked before continuing towards his house. He was nearly at the door when the tall officer suddenly called out, "Could you wait just a moment?" My uncle turned back to find the officer walking towards his wife and daughter's grave, a grave bigger than normal, with fresh dirt beside it. "They haven't searched in there," the tall officer said. The fleeting look of panic on my uncle's face didn't escape the officer, who thereby became more convinced in his hypothesis and called over his subordinates to dig up the grave. "Wait," my uncle quickly approached him, "I might not know the law well, but I believe you need a special search warrant to dig up someone else's grave, don't you?" The officer was stopped by my uncle's interjection but soon regained composure. "You're right, searching a grave does indeed require a special warrant. We'll apply for it right now." "You do that." My uncle's words hung unfinished as the officer interrupted, "I'll stay here, waiting for them to secure the special warrant." The tall officer saw through my uncle's intention. Once they left, my uncle would have the opportunity to move the body again. "You didn't really bury Ethan in that grave, did you?" I asked my uncle. He looked at me incredulously. "He killed my wife and daughter." Do you think it's possible that for revenge, I would place him in their coffin, disturbing their peace? What about the fresh dirt beside the grave? I asked, sotto voce. You figure it out, my uncle replied, leaving room for doubt. It's just fresh dirt from when I was maintaining the grave. Even if I wanted to kill him, I would not allow such a person to disturb my wife and daughter, my uncle assured, seated next to the officer. The officer smirked, saying, You really expect me to believe such a far-fetched explanation? My uncle fell silent, sitting quietly next to the grave with the officer, who no longer spoke, waiting calmly for the special warrant to arrive. When the subordinates returned close to midnight, special officials were brought in to assist with the exhumation, a significant procedure. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. As predicted, the oversized grave harbored an oversized coffin. 4 men stood at its corners, lifting the lid. The sound of collective breaths filled the air as the coffin was opened to reveal only the well-entombed remains of my uncle's wife and daughter. Although the large casket had plenty of vacant space, it did not contain Ethan's body. When I die, I will be buried here with them, my uncle remarked, gazing at the empty coffin. The thin man was left speechless. The search had meticulously covered the not-so-large ranch twice under his command, the surroundings of the ranch, and the nearby town, all without any significant leads. The only clue was someone spotting Ethan walking towards the ranch. Whether he actually entered the ranch or continued beyond to the highway, no one knew. The tall officer finally gave up, apologizing with remorse. We have disturbed you today, I am truly sorry for that. My uncle gestured dismissively, I have been through too much in these years, I don't mind one more time. His tone was light, yet each word carried weight. The tall officer signaled his men to reinter the grave properly, and then he led them away. My uncle watched the police disappear into the thick night, finally letting his body relax completely, collapsing onto the grass. The police never found Ethan's body, and without a body, no case could be filed. As time passed, fewer people cared. Ethan had always been a miscreant, who knew who he had offended or where he might have fled to. In the end, even his parents began to care less, gradually letting the matter go. There was one more development. My uncle reconciled with Ethan's parents. Initially, my uncle approached them with freshly slaughtered chicken and duck he had personally raised, only to be driven out, the gifts thrown and scattered. Unfazed, my uncle persisted. Every so often, he would bring fresh, hormone-free meat from his ranch, always the best cuts. Eventually, Ethan's parents' demeanor softened, accepting the chicken and duck, and sometimes even engaging in brief conversation. Their relationship eased over time, and they eventually buried the hatchet with a smile. Those meats, they weren't Ethan, were they? I thought of this terrifying possibility with horror. How could that be? If I had kept his body, how could the police not find it? My uncle glanced at me disparagingly. Then why did you reconcile with Ethan's parents? I asked. You don't believe I really wanted to make peace with them, my uncle retorted. I thought for a moment, I don't believe it. There were 2 weeks between when my uncle strangled Ethan and the police searched his property, 2 weeks in which he made Ethan's body disappear. He meticulously ground the body into powder with a feed mill, blending it into the feed prepared for the ranch animals. This task, seemingly simple, required immense patience and strength. Once ground into powder and mixed with the feed, naturally, there was no body for the police to seek. They could search all they wanted, but they'd never inspect the gray powdery feed that the chickens, ducks, cows, and sheep were eating right in front of them. No one would use such a meticulous, patience-requiring method to dispose of a corpse. Ethan was gone. You went to that extent. I couldn't believe it. The bones were a bit hard to grind. Luckily his parents took 2 weeks before deciding to call the police. My uncle's voice was a bit hoarse. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, feeling chilled to the bone. I'm about to die. I don't want to go to them carrying such dirty secrets. You've become a writer, can you not write it down properly? My uncle shrugged slightly, the only purpose in my life has been to allow the people I love to rest in peace. Now, I have achieved that. And when you say you're about to die, what do you mean? I inquired. Cancer, he said with a smile, probably just 2 months left. That's why I'm not afraid you'll report me. We were silent for a while. Do you believe in retribution? Do you think I got this disease because of the way I killed Ethan, as a payback from heaven? My uncle suddenly asked. I didn't know how to respond. I don't believe it. I think heaven thinks I've suffered enough, it's time for me to reunite with my wife and daughter. A tear fell from the corner of his eye. His words were finished, dusk was nearing, and it was time for me to leave. So, this is goodbye, his eyes filled with murky tears. 3 months later, my uncle passed away. I took leave from my job to return and help with his funeral arrangements. According to his will, we buried him in the same grave as his wife and daughter. Not many attended the funeral, but it was still simple yet dignified. On the way home from the funeral, I thought back to the day I left my uncle. The last question I asked him standing at his door, the chicken and duck meat you gave to Ethan's parents, it was all raised on the feed made from Ethan, wasn't it? He looked at me with a smile, but he didn't say a word.